Greetings and good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are today. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar, CDC's Response to the Opioid Overdose Epidemic, offered by the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators in partnership with the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. This presentation covers the history of the opioid overdose epidemic, the latest data, the role of substance use and abuse before and after a traumatic brain injury, and CDC's response to the opioid overdose epidemic and intersections with TBI. I'm Susan Vaughn. I'm a member of NASHIA's Training and Education Committee, and Haley Kushin is our webinar organizer today. So thank you all for joining us. For those unfamiliar with NASHIA, we are a nonprofit organization created to assist state government in promoting partnerships and building systems to meet the needs of individuals with brain injury and their families. NASHIA is the only organization representing state employees who work in support of our individuals with brain injuries and their families. Our members come from a variety of settings, including state agencies, advocacy organizations, health and rehabilitation, and community service providers. Many of our members have their own lived experience with brain injury. NASHIA advocates for systems change, provides technical assistance, which if you're interested in technical assistance from our organization, there is a handout on the right on your panel under the handout section that you can download and learn more about what we provide and how to access that. And we provide training and opportunities such as this webcast and our annual State of the States conference. More about our NASHIA, and also our membership, if you are not a member, is also in a handout that you can access off the panel on this webpage. A GoToWebinar user's guide is available for download from the NASHIA website. It is under the webinar and training tab that you would pull down. If you have any problems during this presentation or with this webinar, you may access that document to figure out what's going on, and there's some phone numbers in there you can call. To ask a question during the webinar, please enter it in the questions pane, and our organizer will forward your question to our speaker after the presentation if time allows. If we run out of time, the presenter will respond to your question via email. And you may also submit questions after the webinar if you think of something you want to ask, and you may do so at this email address, training@nashia.org. Our objectives for the presentation today are to discuss the CDC's opioid work and their role in combating the opioid overdose epidemic with other federal agencies, to discuss potential connections between opioid overdoses and traumatic brain injuries and how state brain injury programs can collaborate with their state health departments to raise awareness of TBI-related opioid overdoses. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce our presenters. We have with us Captain Matt Breiding, who joined the U.S. Public Health Service in 2005, first serving as an Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer in the Division of Violence Prevention at CDC. His work focused primarily on the public health surveillance of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and child maltreatment. He contributed to the development and implementation of the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. In 2014, he began serving as the Traumatic Brain Injury Team Leader, which sits within the National Injury Center in the Division of Injury Prevention. In this capacity, he has worked with the team to develop the National Concussion Surveillance System. Also with us today is Michelle Putnam, who is the lead for policy and partnerships in the Division of Overdose Prevention, which sits within CDC's National Injury Center. She oversees partnership engagement and policy activities as related to the public health issues that fall within Division's purview, including prevention efforts around drug overdose and emerging drug threats. Prior to joining the Injury Center, she worked in communications with CDC's Office of the Associate Director for Policy. She has also held policy positions at Georgia-based nonprofits, including Hemophilia of Georgia and Health Staff. Michelle earned her Master of Public Health at Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University and her BA at Georgia State University. And we will be starting first with Michelle, who will start her presentation. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. Both Matt and I are both excited that you've chosen to spend your lunch break with us. So thank you. I think our goal today, as we said at the top of the call, we're in the midst of an opioid overdose epidemic that's driven initially by the overprescribing of opioid prescriptions and the treatment of chronic pain, and more recently, we've seen a sharp rise in heroin-related and now fentanyl-related overdoses. And these are kind of insidious developments that we've seen over the past few years and an epidemic that's really impacting every corner of the country. And so today we really want to talk to you about CDC's work with states throughout our response to this epidemic and the links to brain injury. And Matt and I are going to, I would not be a true policy person if I didn't provide a disclosure and a disclaimer first, but I'll let you all read that. And then we'll keep going. Matt and I are going to start by talking at a very high level about the history of the opioid overdose epidemic and share some of the latest data summarizing the public health burden of the crisis. And then I'll turn it over to Matt to detail the role of substance use and misuse before and after a TBI. And we'll share kind of where we've been, describing the kind of work that we've been doing with states, along with some of our TBI-related activities. And then finally, I'll close us out by talking about a new funding opportunity that we launched back in September of this year that I think could be especially pertinent to you all at the state level. And by the end of the hour, our hope is that you walk away with an understanding of these objectives, mainly kind of understanding the history of the epidemic, CDC's role, both what we're doing here, but also in the context of the entire federal government's actions around the opioid overdose epidemic, and how, as head injury administrators, you all can collaborate at the state in relation to some of these opioid overdose activities. So I'll start by, of course, CDC is known by its data, so we'll start with some charts and graphs that I think tell the story of where we stand with the opioid overdose epidemic. To fully grasp the devastating impact of this public health crisis, we kind of have to marry both the stories of the lives lost and lives dramatically transformed with pictures and data. And so I'm a very visual person, and I think this gives a good representation of just how far we've come in this epidemic and how it is impacting pretty much every county in the United States. Many of us have been touched directly or indirectly as family members and friends have struggled with or sometimes lost their battle to substance use. And I always like to remember that each of those personal stories are made up in these pictures too. So if you think of if you follow this through 2000 all the way up to recent years, you see increasing red, but those, of course, are lives lost, and I think that the manifestation of this epidemic is there are a lot more lives that are impacted by kind of what we see on the screen. And I'm going to go on to the next slide. The impact of the opioid overdose epidemic is so pronounced that it's significantly altering U.S. life expectancy, and these graphs show the relative contribution of the 12 leading causes of death on how long Americans might live. And you see that from 2000 to 2015, advances in medicine and changes in lifestyle extended the average American lifespan and decreased the toll that we had seen from heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and other causes of death. But the same is not true for drug poisoning overall and opioids specifically. So the bottom third of the graph kind of separates out these deaths. And U.S. life expectancy has decreased over 2 months from 2000 to 2015 as a result of opioids alone. And while that might not seem like a huge number, 2 months, to get a decrease as large as that means that the 2015 birth cohort will live over 800,000 fewer years of life. And just to put this in stark contrast, in 2017, we had over 47,000 opioid overdose deaths and over 70,000 drug overdose deaths. And this marks the first time in 100 years, or basically since the 1918 flu pandemic, when U.S. life expectancy decreased for 3 consecutive years. And I do want to point out that provisional data up to March 2019 puts predicted drug overdose numbers at right at 69,000. So the numbers are still quite high. And again, that's provisional data, and we'll know more when final 2018 data is released. But this epidemic is still continuing, largely driven by synthetic opioids. And so on the next slide, I just want to detail the confluence of factors that have led to this epidemic and led to those earlier numbers that we were showing. So first, we did have pain being designated a fifth vital sign early on in the mid-1990s. And second, we had kind of an underappreciation of the addictive potential of prescription opioids. There was some limited literature with some methodological flaws that mischaracterized the risk of addiction. This was alongside some aggressive marketing of these drugs to clinicians, and also some kind of rogue actions by some clinicians who ran, what we call pill mills that profited from overprescribing. And the last two are kind of associated with the later waves of this epidemic and associated with illicit opioids. So we've seen some sophisticated actions of drug traffickers that have kind of continue to open up the market to new substances, and then last being kind of the introduction of illicitly manufactured fentanyl into the drug market. And that's kind of led to some of the numbers that we're seeing. Here at CDC, we do describe this epidemic in three distinct waves, and I'll talk potentially, about current trends that may or may not signal a fourth wave. But I just want to again mention that even still, overall drug overdose deaths have never been higher, and 2 out of 3 of these deaths still involve opioids. And over 400,000 people have died from drug overdoses involving opioids, whether prescription or illicit in the U.S. over the last 19 years. And so this chart kind of walks us through the 3 waves. The first wave is deaths related to prescription opioids. So nearly 200,000 people died from overdoses involving prescription opioids in the United States since 1999. And in 2017, we were losing over 46 Americans a day to prescription opioid overdose. Deaths from these kind of, again, I use the layman terms, prescription opioids increased 4-fold between 1999 and 2011. So that's really the first wave that you're seeing here. I will say, again, alluding to some provisional data that our colleagues over at the National Center for Health Statistics maintain, provisional data up to March 2019 shows that deaths from prescription opioids are slightly declining, but I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't say that they still remain quite high and that they're still 3 times higher than they were in 1999. The second wave of the opioid overdose epidemic involves heroin. So around 2010, we started seeing some increases in heroin-related deaths, and those have increased over five-fold since 2010, with over 15,000 Americans dying from a heroin-related overdose in 2017. Again, I want to point out, positive signals where I can, and from 2016 to 2017, we did see that overdose rates related to heroin remain stable. But again, the overdose rates are still quite high, and there's still a lot of work to do. The third wave in this epidemic is related to fentanyl. Most cases of fentanyl-related morbidity and mortality that we are seeing is linked to illicitly manufactured fentanyl when it's laced with other substances like heroin, cocaine, meth, and other drugs. And the number of deaths for these synthetic opioids, and this is excluding methadone, has increased over 6-fold since 2013. And according to 2017 data, which is the latest final data that we have available, more than 28,000 Americans died from synthetic opioids. Again, I'll mention provisional data. Again, this is data that is kept up by our colleagues over at National Center for Health Statistics, and it is not considered final data, but it does give us a sign of signaling the latest trends. And provisional data does show that numbers due to fentanyl overdoses are most likely going to continue to rise. Lastly, I just want to signal, kind of talking about current trends. We're not calling this a fourth wave, but what we are noticing is that there are some increases in deaths from cocaine and other psychostimulants. And one of the areas that we're focusing on here at CDC is trying to tease out some of these polysubstance overdose deaths. And I will note that when it comes in late March 2018, and I can make sure you all have these resources and these publications that I'm citing, we did release kind of a detailed analysis of drug overdose deaths, and we did see stark increases in deaths related to cocaine and psychostimulants. We saw cocaine increase by 50% and deaths from psychostimulants increase by 33% in just over a year. And that continues a trend that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. To give you some perspective, in 2017, almost 18,000 people died of cocaine or psychostimulants like methamphetamine. And this is compared to slightly over 9,700 back in 2014. So we've been seeing some increases in those two substances. Now, to give some context, rates of psychostimulants and deaths due to substances like meth have been increasing since 2010, but even in 2017, we saw a 37% increase in psychostimulant deaths from the previous year. And some of this is being driven by just an increase in overall polysubstance use. The recent data that we have indicate that involvement of opioids in some of these stimulant-involved deaths are increasing. To give you an idea of what that looks like, nearly 3/4 of cocaine-involved deaths involved in opioid in 2017, and half of psychostimulant deaths involved in opioid in 2017. So again, this is just to relay the point that this is becoming an increasingly complex epidemic with a lot of polysubstance use at play. And of course, the impact on individual states is constantly evolving, and this epidemic doesn't look alike even within one state. So, if you look at a state like West Virginia, one area of the state, certain cities can have high overdose deaths related to prescription opioids. Another side of the state may have, a high overdose death rate related to illicitly manufactured fentanyl. So again, just kind of belies the complexity of this epidemic. And of course, I do want to note that, a lot of the time CDC is known for focusing on mortality data, so death data, but we know that overdose deaths are just the tip of the iceberg, and there are many, many more non-fatal overdoses. And so these non-fatal data are the most timely available to CDC, and they may serve as kind of a signal for future changes in deaths. And I also like to look at it as this non-fatal data is really an opportunity for us to prevent, future overdoses. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but at CDC we are focusing on some linkage to care components and linking people to care if they're seen in an emergency department or if they're seen by EMS, that we're linking them to care right then and there, kind of in a no wrong door approach. But I do want to talk briefly about some of the non-fatal data, and I want to note that we update this data quarterly on our website, so I can make sure that you all have the link to where this is housed on our overarching CDC website. But the data from this slide is from March 2018 and just continues to show that opioid overdoses are increasing across all regions and in most states, and for both men and women and most age groups. So again, just relays the point that there's probably not a person that hasn't been touched by this epidemic in the United States. And so as of March 2018, we had saw that ED visits increased by about 30% from July 2016 through September 2017 in 52 jurisdictions in 45 states. And these are all states that were participating in our enhanced surveillance program. We also saw some drastic increases in Midwestern states, so about a 70% increase in some of those Midwestern states, which is kind of what we're seeing across the board with some of the data as far as overall drug overdoses. We've kind of seen the progression of overdose deaths expanding westward, and I can talk about that when I start talking about some of our overdose prevention programs later on. In the 16 states hardest hit by the opioid overdose epidemic, we saw increases averaging across 35%. Again, I think this data is kind of a signaling point of where we can potentially start linking people to care and eventually hope preventing future overdose deaths. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the what we see as far as prescription opioids. I mentioned that first wave, and and how it began with opioid prescribing. And so we do know, CDC has put out a CDC guideline with some of the evidence around safer prescribing, but we do know that as dose goes up, risk goes up. So risk of overdose goes up as you increase the dose of opioids, both for acute and chronic pain. And so this graph basically shows that among patients receiving opioid prescriptions for pain, the higher opioid doses were associated with increased risk of opioid overdose death. So, for example, those patients on a maximum prescribed daily dose above 100 morphine milligram equivalents, there was a 7-fold increase in death. And even for patients in the range of 50 to 100 morphine milligram equivalents, the risk was almost 5-fold. And so data from studies like this align both with the CDC guideline as far as safer prescribing and can potentially signal some efforts that can hopefully reduce prescription opioid overdose related deaths later on. And, as I mentioned earlier, essential premise leading to the use of prescription opioids was kind of the argument that, if you use it properly, it would not lead to opioid use disorder. And, an increasing body of literature is kind of debunking this, especially when you talk about high daily doses that are taken for greater than 90 days. And so this chart is basically showing that patients on a long duration and a high dose opioid prescription, so over 90 days at greater than 120 MME, they have a 122-fold increase in the likelihood of being diagnosed with opioid use disorder. And even at lower doses, there's still kind of a 15-fold increase. And so I'm going to talk about, I know I've talked about several studies, but I do want to talk about one more because, again, I think these prescription opioid overdose prescribing practices partly led to that first wave of the epidemic. And so this study examines early opioid prescribing patterns in opioid-naive patients that eventually led to long-term opioid use. Researchers found that the likelihood of chronic opioid use increased with each additional day of medication supplied, starting with the third day. And the sharpest increases in long-term opioid use observed after both the 5th and the 31st day. So again, kind of points to some increasing body of literature that looks at not only high dose, but also day supply can potentially impact long-term use. And I wanted to lay out some additional context here to give you an idea of the most common drugs involved in prescription opioid overdose deaths based on prescribing data that we've seen. And those drugs include methadone, oxycodone, and hydrocodone. And again, I emphasized earlier some of the overdose deaths related to prescription opioids potentially were stabilized. But I do want to note that in 2017, prescription opioid overdose death rates significantly increased among people over age 65. And although we've had some initial success when it comes to decreasing opioid overdose prescribing, when it comes to both high dose and number of days supply, we have had some success there. There's still a lot of work to do because prescribing is still, like I said, 3 times higher than it was in 1999. So we've made some progress, but there's still a lot of work to do there. And I want to talk about kind of, what you probably, some of you already are familiar with, substance use, misuse, and abuse. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, Matt, sorry. I get really excited when I talk about this thing. I'm going to turn it over to Matt and let you actually do the talking for this slide. Apologies, Matt.
No trouble. That's understandable. Yes, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the connection between TBI and substance use and misuse. And so start off with what we know. So as you probably know, substance use and misuse more typically precedes brain injury than is the result of it. However, we know that the relationship is bidirectional and it's complicated and it might be changing. We know that substance use or misuse is common pre-injury. One review highlighted that up to 37% of individuals had pre-injury illicit drug use. Now, this is much lower than pre-injury alcohol use, which was shown to be as high as 79%. Substance use also increases risk-taking behaviors linked to sustaining a TBI. And that can include impairment causing a motor vehicle crash injury or a fall resulting in an injury. while there's limited information about illicit use, we know that over 50% of individuals have a blood alcohol content that is above the legal limit at the time of admission, and the relationship between impairment and risk is pretty well established. So while research suggests that substance use or misuse wanes in the first few months after a TBI, likely due to medical support or family supervision, there is frequently an increase in use about 8 to 12 months post-injury. Previous research has shown us that. We think that things like social isolations and the consequences of the TBI, such as increased impulsivity, irritability, as well as new cognitive limitations, may increase use at that time. And this can, this use, the substance use, can negatively influence the success of rehabilitation efforts as well. So that's of significant concern. We know that chronic pain is a common comorbidity with TBI, and as Michelle talked about, opioids were increasingly used to treat this type of pain starting in the late 1990s and continuing on into the 2000s. And then finally, there's a rich literature that has looked at pre-injury alcohol use and a range of long-term outcomes. This includes decreased likelihood of return to work, life satisfaction, poor health outcomes, and an increased risk of re-injury. However, few studies have evaluated pre-injury illicit drug use on these outcomes long-term. So you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. The effects of and dangers to alcohol and drug use after a TBI are well known. These include an increased risk of injuries and seizures, an exacerbation of cognitive, behavioral, and emotional difficulties, possible interaction with prescribed medications, and then, as mentioned previously, diminished benefits of rehabilitation. And we suspect that there are other effects too. So in terms of a profile of who's at higher risk for post-injury misuse, this includes those who have abused substances pre-injury, intoxication or impairment at the time of injury, a family history of substance abuse problems, a denial of knowledge of the dangers of abuse. And then we also know that younger people, such as those less than 25, are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. Next slide, please. So we're aware of the connections between TBI and our unintentional injury priority areas, including opioids. In fact, opioids can cause their own form of brain injury through a decrease or temporary suspension of oxygen available to the brain. A hypoxic brain injury occurs when the brain does not receive enough oxygen. So initially the body responds by increasing blood flow to the brain, but if oxygen deprivation continues, this can have short and long-term psychological and neurological effects that could include coma, permanent brain damage, or even death. Now, an anoxic brain injury occurs when the brain does not receive any oxygen, and in these situations, the severity of the brain injury depends on the length and extent of oxygen deprivation. These new powerful synthetic opioids like illicit fentanyl and its analogs have really elevated the risk of this type of brain injury because even if naloxone is present, it can't be delivered fast enough or in sufficient dosage to counteract the effects. Now, currently, there's not enough literature or data to assess an accurate burden of anoxic brain injuries due to opioid overdoses, and that's really another compelling reason why we need better TBI data and surveillance. So next slide. Pain is one of the most common comorbid health issues for patients sustaining a TBI. Over 50% of both military members and civilians who sustain a TBI report pain-related problems during recovery and beyond the point of resolution of other TBI symptoms. In military members, chronic pain often shows up as part of a clinical triad that can include TBI, pain, and psychological issues such as PTSD, anxiety, depression. And chronic pain is more common among patients who suffered a TBI in combat. We also know that chronic pain is just as prevalent in patients following a mild TBI versus a moderate or severe TBI. And given that we estimate about 75% of TBI is mild. This puts a very large group of people at risk of the prescribing trends that have changed and the use of opioids that were increased to treat chronic pain in the late 90s. So by 2010, among the most frequent indications for opioid misuse, chronic non-cancer pain accounted for about half of the U.S. opioids market. Next slide, please. So multiple studies show that opioid use for chronic pain is more common in individuals with mental health problems. Unfortunately, opioid use can exacerbate mental health conditions. It can worsen psychosocial functioning. It can heighten the risk for serious adverse events, and that includes overdose and overdose death. A recent retrospective cohort study of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans looked at opioid prescribing patterns in about 53,000 veterans with a comprehensive TBI evaluation. And what they found was that close to 1/4, or 22%, of veterans with chronic pain and TBI initiated opioid therapy in the year after the TBI evaluation. Had included about 3.5% of veterans who were on long-term opioid therapy. And then finally, veterans with depression, PTSD, and moderate and severe TBI had nearly 3.6 times the odds of being on long-term opioid therapy. And so this really makes an already vulnerable population of veterans at greater risk for adverse clinical outcomes. And so move to the next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Great, thanks, Matt. And so now we'll kind of talk about a little bit about what CDC is kind of doing about some of the data that we just presented. And I will say that CDC, our North Star, is basically to reduce opioid-related harms and overdose deaths now. So we are in the middle of a public health crisis, and so a lot of our activities are focused on what can we do to prevent death in the current moment. And so kind of having this clear direction, it generally just guides our actions here at CDC, governs our strategic decision-making around priorities, and helps us benchmark whether we're making progress. And I want to go over briefly some of the pillars of CDC's activities. And so we have 5 priority areas that map to CDC's niche and complement the work of others across the federal government. And I'll talk about some of that work in a moment. But our priorities and our central pillars are to improve data quality and track trends. We do this through some of our enhanced surveillance programs that I alluded to earlier. So when it comes to some of the non-fatal data that I presented, that's basically born out of our enhanced surveillance efforts that we're doing here within the Injury Center. The second pillar is to strengthen state, local, and tribal capacity to scale up evidence-based prevention programs. And I'm actually going to talk about this one at length in a moment when it comes to our overdose data to action funding opportunity. But I do want to mention that, you know, our efforts do focus now, I want to emphasize, across both state and localities. We're funding localities for the first time with this new funding opportunity that we launched in September. And we're also, in FY 2018, we began funding tribes directly, so we're increasing our activities in those areas as well. The third pillar I think is probably very relevant to this group. It's around improving patient safety by equipping providers with data, tools, and resources they need to implement safer prescribing practices. A lot of this work revolves around implementation of our 2016 guidelines, but it also includes tools and resources that we're developing aimed at providers around not only implementing the guidelines, but also talking with patients, screening for opioid use disorder, and just equipping them with trainings on how to increase communication with patients and the public. The fourth pillar is around building our collaboration between public health and law enforcement, and we're working on this both at the federal level, but we're also funding some programs at the state and local level to improve these collaborative relationships. And within these programs, we run the public health component of what's called the overdose response strategy, and work very closely with high-intensity drug trafficking areas, with a lot of our focus being on sharing data where we can, but also in increasing, criminal justice programs and linking people to care and medication-assisted treatment when it comes to criminal justice. what am I on the fifth pillar? The last one that I'll talk about is empowering the public to make safer choices. We do this a lot through one of our seminal campaigns called it's RX Awareness Campaign, and the tagline, it only takes a little to lose a lot. And I will mention that we do fund states to implement both this campaign and kind of hybrid campaigns that are focused on decreasing stigma and increasing the consumer awareness around the risks of prescription opioids. And I want to, briefly note before I go into some of our, specifically into how we support states and tribes, this work has been scaled up very quickly over here at the Injury Center, and we've gone from, no congressional appropriation around opioids, several years ago to an appropriation of $475 million. So that just gets at, I think, the overarching effort that across the board, this is states and the federal government are really focused on this. I do want to give, again, I said earlier at the top of the call, I enjoy visuals, and this is pulled from a vital signs that we released in 2018, but I do love it because I think it gives a visual depiction of how public health can assist and work with others when it comes to coordinating responses to this epidemic across all sectors. So again, this gets to some of the pillars I just mentioned, including both public health as well as public safety and community programs. And I think that's especially relevant when you talk about linkage to care and linking people to care and treatment, which is kind of a new pillar, a new objective that's been embedded in our latest funding opportunity. Which leads me to overdose data to action. So I'll note previously that we had, and I think when I've been on calls before, I've talked about our overdose prevention in states effort, and that was kind of 4 separate programs that we had created over time, and there were 4 separate programs because of just the way we had been appropriated funding. And one program was focused on enhanced surveillance, the other program was focused on prevention strategies. And we, going forward, those programs culminated last year, and going forward, we combined them into one kind of mega program that we're calling Overdose Data to Action. And that program kicked off in September of this year, and it really integrates activities funded through those existing multi-year programs. And it's a $300 million a year funding opportunity for a 3-year cooperative agreement. And we're funding 47 states, DC, and 16 localities and 2 territories through this program, with the overarching goal to advance the understanding of the opioid overdose epidemic, including polysubstance use, and to scale up prevention and response activities. And of course, I can point you all to our website, and we've got a map here that includes not only the states we're funding, so it's 47 states in DC, but also some of the localities that we're funding. And again, I mentioned earlier that this is the first time that we are directly funding localities, and we were empowered to do that through congressional appropriations language last year. So this is kind of a new and exciting opportunity for us in an effort to get dollars out to the hardest hit areas within states. So over the next 3 years, OD2A, or Overdose Data to Action recipients, will gather and rapidly report data that includes the substances, circumstances, and locations leading to overdose and deaths. And in addition, they'll work to strengthen prescription drug monitoring programs, improve state and local integration, and establish linkages to care, and improve provider and health system support. And for the purpose of this call, I want to go over some components of the funding that I think would be most relevant to you all, especially within some of the prevention areas that we're working on. So I mentioned before that we are funding localities for the first time, but in addition, states that are funded, we do have a requirement in this funding opportunity that we did not have in previous funding opportunities, that 20% of prevention dollars must go to local partners, so local community health departments and community areas where the funds are additional funds are needed. We're also including within this notice of funding opportunity linkage to care requirements. So we're trying to focus on a systems level approach to connecting individuals in need of care with those that provide that care. Again, when I showed that non-fatal data at the top of the call, we saw that there was a need, especially in places like our emergency departments, to focus on what are some of those systems level approaches, like emergency department protocols, where we can ensure that people are being linked to care, or at least being followed up by peer navigators so that we can get them into treatment. And of course, it may not happen the first time, may not happen the second time, but again, we keep trying so that we can get people into treatment for substance use disorder. And the last one that I want to emphasize for this group of particular relevance is some of the providers and health system support. So again, this is a required strategy that states and localities are required to do under overdose data to action. And this is basically working with providers and health systems so that they're equipped to contribute to prevention and response around opioid overdose. This includes not only academic detailing for providers, but also includes coordinated care programs and some insurer mechanisms to ensure appropriate care and safer prescribing. And I bring that up just because I think some of the coordinated care and some of the provider outreach, could also include kind of what Matt alluded to earlier with some of the intersection we know that exists between opioids and TBI. So that is just a brief snippet of overdose data to action. And here, of course, this slide gives you an idea of exactly how complex it is and some of the, both the required surveillance strategies and the required prevention strategies that I just mentioned. Again, kind of pointing out that I think a lot of what our work has been over the past several years is building up some innovative strategies and seeing what works. And OD2A, this Overdose Data to Action funding opportunity, gives us an opportunity to build the evidence around some of these strategies and, kind of require some activities that we know have a good evidence base around them. And one thing that I failed to mention on the previous slide, but I did mention earlier, is campaigns. We have our RX awareness campaign, but states I mentioned also kind of develop their own hybrid campaigns, whether it be for, the general public or whether it be kind of some maybe targeted campaigns to providers and clinicians. And I think that that's also an opportunity for this audience to connect with the state health department to see what activities they have underway in regards to some of those campaigns. And just to summarize, so that's kind of an idea of what CDC is doing. But again, this is within the context of an overarching HHS and administration strategy to prevent opioid overdoses and to kind of reverse this epidemic. So we're just one slice of the pie here. There's a lot of other federal entities that I think do a lot around opioid overdose prevention. And we work closely with them to ensure that, of course, we're not duplicating activities, and kind of each one has a certain niche, and we're more than happy to make connections to some of these federal entities too, so that you can learn more about what they're doing. But we work closely with CMS, especially when it comes to safer prescribing and particularly around implementation of our CDC guidelines. We work closely with the Surgeon General, of course, the nation's doctor. He's always on the front lines talking about the opioid overdose epidemic and emerging drug threats. He's been out there talking about stimulants and cocaine as well, and other agencies around NIH. So we work closely with them, of course, to see what kind of research they have underway. They have their larger overarching HEAL initiative that we've collaborated with them on. FDA, we work closely, again, when it comes to some of the safer prescribing practices. And, of course, SAMHSA, which is largely focused on treatment. And, again, I kind of emphasized our niche is kind of linking people to care and treatment. And, SAMHSA is really focused on increasing access to care and treatment and making sure that people stay in treatment once they're there. And there are some other programs that we also work with, the VA, Department of Labor, DEA. We work closely with them when it comes to collaborating with public health and public safety, and, housing and urban development. I think one of the things that, with our overarching overdose prevention programs that we have, I mentioned earlier that, our North Star, this being a public health crisis, is to prevent opioid overdose deaths. And I think as we look, further and further into the public health role, there's a lot of things that we could do around upstream prevention efforts, particularly around adverse childhood experiences, which is one of our overarching center's strategic priorities. And so I think a lot of these agencies touch on some of those upstream prevention efforts as well. But again, that's just to give you a sense of some of the other activities going on at the federal level. And now I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So I'm just going to close out by bringing it back to the connection between TBI and opioids. As we've discussed this afternoon, the effects of the opioid overdose epidemic are really wide-reaching in this country, and they intersect with a lot of the topics that we study in the Injury Center. So opioids intersect with suicide, with motor vehicle safety, with older adult falls, and again with TBI. And when it comes to our TBI work, if you've been on a webinar before, you've heard me talk about the current priorities of our TBI team. For those who haven't, these include better describing the public health burden of TBI, so coming up with better estimates of how many people experience a TBI in a given year. What are the long range effects of a TBI? Other priorities include changing the culture of youth sports related to concussion, identifying optimal return to learn practices, addressing the challenges of managing TBI in rural settings. However, we are exploring what data is currently available surrounding anoxic brain injuries as a result of an overdose and substance use as a result of TBI. So we have a number of analyses ongoing. Unfortunately, I don't have anything new to share today, but I assure you that when we are ready to, we will share it. So with that, I think we'll move on to the next slide, and I think that's just a slide indicating we're open for questions.
I'd like to take the time to thank our speakers today and all the important work that CDC does in this area. And I also thank Matt and Michelle for taking the time to share this update with us. As a reminder, if you have questions, you may feel free to type them on the right on your questions panel. There's a pane there. You can type your questions, and we can then ask our presenters to address those questions. If you do not have a question at this moment, but feel that you may have a question at the end of the webinar, just feel free to go ahead and forward it to us. You can do it at the training@nashia.org, and we can take that and follow up with our speakers. So with that, I'm going to close out by thanking everyone. I thanked our speakers for their wonderful presentations. I also thank all of you who joined us today. If you are not a member of NASHIA, we certainly invite you to become one. As I mentioned earlier, there is a brochure or a handout that's in the pane on handouts about NASHIA, and in that, it has information about becoming a member. There's also a way to join by clicking on our website on www.nashia.org. You can join that way, or you can contact Becky. Now, I understand there is a question. I'm not seeing it. So, Haley, does somebody see the question in that pane that can?
Yes, I've got it right here.
Okay.
Jan White wants to know, is CDC working on a system for identifying ABI in overdose?
So I'll take this one. So we aren't currently working on a system that would capture that information going forward, but there are a few data sets that are in existence where we think we can look at that connection. And so that's just what I was mentioning earlier, is that those are the kinds of things where we're currently conducting some analyses. One is the TBI Model Systems database, which has been a rich source of information on the short, medium, and long-term outcomes after a moderate and severe TBI. So we're using that, and then also a data source called Market Scan. And so we have a number of things in process, and they are continuing to collect that kind of information. It may not be, ideally what we would design to get at the best information, but I think we can answer a number of questions using existing data sources.
Thank you, Matt. Also, we've got another question. We've got a question if the copy of the PowerPoint will be available. That is in your handout section. There are two handouts related to the PowerPoint. There's one in a 3-slide format with a notes section, and there's also another which is the identical PowerPoint, but is in a 6-slide handout. If you can't access your handouts, please feel free to send us an email at training@nashia.org, and I'll be happy to give you a copy of the PowerPoint today in a PDF format. I believe that is all the questions we have. Susan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, in closing, thank you all again, and thanks to CDC. CDC has regularly helped us with webinars to keep us informed of all their work they're doing around brain injury, and we always appreciate that opportunity. So again, if you think of something else you want to know about, whether it's regarding the webinar or regarding our organization or any assistance we can provide you, just feel free to contact us. And Becky's, our executive director's emails on that slide at execdirector@nashia.org, or as Haley said, you can send to her at memberservices@nashia.org, and we can follow up with you. And with that, I again close this out, and thanks to everyone who joined us today, and have a great Wednesday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you still there?